being used in schools to educate students. The stakes for this kind of thing are really high, and it really does matter which values we are giving to these machines and telling them to emulate. So you could imagine, companies making those values, but we know now that that's not a foolproof process. You can imagine users making these decisions about what values they want AI to have, but that has the problem that you just alluded to. There are other kinds of experiments that you can imagine running. What if you let people vote on how they want chatbots to behave? What if it was some sort of democratic process? But that has its own trade-offs too. So I don't think there's a perfect answer out there, but I'm positive that as these AI systems continue to get better and more capable, this issue of what values do they have? Are they aligned with my values as a user? That's only going to become more and more pressing, and the pressure on companies like Google to please everyone with these chatbots is only going to get more and more intense.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
The latest episode of Kevin's podcast, Hard Fork, which covers the world of tech, is out tomorrow. To find it, search for Hard Fork wherever you listen. We'll be right back.
What can pediatric heart surgeons learn from engineers? Why are cancer drugs sometimes the key to alleviating pediatric epilepsy? And what factors are underlying the youth mental health crisis? I'm Zakiya Watley, and I'm the host of Breakthrough, a podcast from Boston Children's. In Season 2 of Breakthrough, I'll speak to top doctors at the nation's leading pediatric research institution to answer these questions and more. Listen to Breakthrough now to learn about the work happening today that could change the lives of countless children tomorrow.
Here's what else you need to know today.
I am filled with the gratitude for the outpouring of support we've received from all across our great country. But the time has now come to suspend my campaign.
Nikki Haley ended her campaign for the Republican presidential nomination on Wednesday, following a string of resounding losses on Super Tuesday that left her with no chance of stopping Donald Trump. In 15 races across the U.S., Trump won all but one state, Vermont, bringing his delegate count up to more than 1,000. Haley, by comparison, has fewer than 90.
In all likelihood, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee when our party convention meets in July.
But unlike nearly every other Republican candidate who has left the race, Haley chose not to endorse Trump.
It is now up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those in our party and beyond it who did not support him. And I hope he does that. This is now his time for choosing.
And the Houthi militia has claimed responsibility for an attack on a commercial vessel off the coast of Yemen that killed 2 people on Wednesday. The deaths are the first fatalities from Houthi attacks since the group began targeting ships late last year as a form of protest against Israel's invasion of Gaza. Today's episode was produced by Stella Tan, Asta Chaturvedi, and Mary Wilson, with research help by Susan Lee. It was edited by Brendan Klinkenberg, contains original music by Diane Wong, Marian Lozano, and Will Reed, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley. Our theme music is by Jim Rumberg and Ben Lansberg of Wonderly. That's it for today. I'm Michael Bobaro. See you tomorrow.
This episode is supported by Boston Children's. Listen to the new podcast, Breakthrough by Boston Children's, wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is sponsored by 1630 Fund.
From postpartum health to menopause, women's health companies are innovating.
We are, at this point in time, really have just scratched the surface of what I think is possible.
One doctor wants to give women the tools to close the gender data gap in medicine.
One goal is to change the conversation around menstrual blood and being this stigma, taboo, to actually, this is an incredible opportunity in terms of information about what's going on in our bodies.
I'm Nyla Budu from Axios. This is One Big Thing. Mainstream headlines about women's health over the last few years have been dominated by developments in the courts and state houses. Alabama's IVF battle, the Supreme Court on abortion, and ensuing state-led efforts to restrict or change access to reproductive care. So you'd be forgiven for not seeing some of the business and science leaps that are happening right now. Even as Axios' senior healthcare editor, Adriel Bettelheim, told me, women's health remains
underfunded. It's estimated only 1% of medical research spending goes toward female-specific conditions that aren't related to cancer. Groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are trying to narrow the gender gap and harness some of the scientific and technological advances that are occurring in other areas of healthcare. New types of contraceptives like once-a-month pills or injectable contraceptives that last 6 months and that could find great utility in poorer nations. AI-enabled portable ultrasound machines that are being developed to identify high-risk pregnancies or estimate gestational age. And there's just a lot of work now in collecting and harmonizing data and modeling, increasing female representation in medical studies, and using technologies like organs on a chip to personalize treatments across a lifetime. The Biden administration in November announced a White House initiative on women's health research to push for new diagnostic tools and treatments to manage conditions including menopause, endometriosis, and cardiovascular disease. Some people think the pace will pick up with more female investors reshaping the male-oriented venture capital world and putting more resources into what's traditionally been viewed as kind of a niche market, startups focused on women's health. There are estimates that by the end of this decade, the women's health market could be worth over $1 trillion with new diagnostics and digital platforms designed for women's needs.
Adriel Bettelheim is Axios' senior healthcare editor. The woman behind one of the health companies making strides in 2024 is Dr. Sarah Nasseri, who's working to reframe menstrual blood as a diagnostic tool rather than waste. She says that's valuable for how we talk about women's health, and it could transform women's healthcare. Dr. Nasseri first started down this road while in medical school, where as she saw patients, she kept having the same thought over and over.
Oh, I wish you'd come in earlier. And if I had to boil down the 7 years I spent in medical school to kind of what my experience was, it was very much about reactive care, so to speak. So, very little time was spent on early detection and early diagnosis and prevention. And so I really was sort of thinking through, well, how can we get information about our bodies when we're outside the doctor's office, regularly, non-invasively.
Some 70% of healthcare decisions rely on lab tests. That's according to the CDC. And while there's some debate over that precise number, there's no question that blood tests play a major role in disease prevention and treatment.
And then one day it just sort of hit me, and I actually remember the moment pretty vividly because it was sort of like, hold on a minute, women bleed every month. Why has nobody looked at that, right? And the next couple of months following that, it was sort of shocking, honestly, to learn how little information had been published by the clinical and scientific community on the clinical utility of menstrual blood.
So Dr. Nasseri founded a company in 2014 called Quinn that received FDA clearance in January of this year for a new kind of blood test.
We've built a way for women to get insights about their health regularly, non-invasively, using blood that comes every month, the menstrual blood. And it's essentially a modified menstrual pad that collects a small volume of blood that we can test for various clinically relevant health markers.
I sat down with her to understand how this works. Dr. Sarah Nasseri is the CEO and co-founder of Quinn. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, Nyla.
So what kind of markers, what kind of information can you get out of this blood?
there's a lot of clinically relevant information in this bodily fluid that comes every month. And so as of today, we have the QPAD itself is FDA cleared as a medical device and can test for A1C, hemoglobin A1C, which is your average blood sugar. It's a marker that diabetics, people that live with diabetes, have to monitor often. It's how we diagnose diabetes. Women also use it for general wellness to kind of understand where the blood glucose is. On top of that, we have looked at a number of different biomarkers and they have validated those in a clinical lab, and it's biomarkers such as thyroid hormone, it's fertility hormones, inflammation markers, hemoglobin. And then one of the things that I'm really, really excited about, I think, as a team we are really passionate about, is we have done bigger trials on cervical cancer screening, and the idea that we can bring screening to women in a very convenient way by just having women wear this specific menstrual pad, and we can screen for what the strains of viruses that cause cervical cancer and really make that convenient and accessible. So these are some of the examples of things that we've looked at, that we have validated, and I, again, really do believe that this is just the beginning of what will become a very big opportunity in women's health, hopefully.
So you said when you started this journey, you couldn't find much research to help you?
In fact, there was only one paper on the proteomics of menstrual blood, which was done by the forensic department in New York. And so that took me there, and I met with the professor who did the first study looking at the proteomics. And it was just this crazy story, Nyla, of there was this murder case essentially, and the suspect said, this dried blood on the couch is menstrual blood. And we had no sort of real good way to sort of prove the difference in that. And so they did the first study looking at the proteomics to understand how it's different, so that could help solve this forensics case and others that have come since then. And so they're actually working on putting together a standard to differentiate, and in parallel we're working on in the same kind of field, but obviously for us it's not about solving forensic cases, but it's about how do we make healthcare more accessible to women, how do we utilize this incredible opportunity that menstrual blood really is for women in gaining and obtaining health information and becoming preventative about their healthcare.
What's proteomic?
It's basically the forensic department looked at all the proteins, the different markers you may find in menstrual blood, and compared that to systemic blood, to venous blood that you get, when you get a needle poked in your arm, and sort of understood what are the differences there. And then what we did following that was sort of to say, okay, so if I take something like your cholesterol or your, let's say, your thyroid hormone or average blood sugar for that matter, and I monitor that in a menstrual blood sample, and then I also do a blood draw and I compare the two, what is the correlation? That's some of the work that we've done over the past many years to understand, how can we utilize this from a clinical perspective. And to some extent it's blood, right? So a lot of these markers do correlate very, very well, and that's what made the QPAD, the product that we built, sort of that started that process once we had sort of determined that there is certain clinical utility.
Is menstrual blood as clinically relevant as blood that you draw from your arm or a finger stick or any other method?
Yeah, so what we've shown, and partly going through an FDA clearance process, what we had to show, particularly with something like A1C as an example, is that exactly what you're asking, is this the same as if you were to go down and get a venipuncture? And the answer is yes, it is.
And the FDA had to create a new product category for this? Why is that?
I think we are the first diagnostic menstrual pad ever to get cleared by the FDA, and so in that way it is so novel, and there's just nothing that exists out there just like the QPAD. So that's why they had to create this new category, and here we have this incredible opportunity that frankly has never been looked at or regarded as something positive. And part of what we hope to do with Quinn is, one, to of course provide relevant information regularly to women, help them become more proactive about their healthcare. We think not just about how this is an incredible opportunity for women who are, busy with their lives, important in our workforce, busy with family life, but want to stay on top of their health, but also for women who live in more rural areas of America and frankly the world, right, where there is nobody there to do something like a pap smear. And it's the inconvenience and the cost and the time associated with getting information about our bodies is just a very big barrier for a lot of women, and that should not be the case in 2024. So that's one goal. The other goal is to use that information that we finally can collect very easily to actually enhance women's health, an area of healthcare that has been overlooked. And then lastly, it is to change the conversation around menstrual blood from being this stigma, taboo, to some extent still in many areas shameful event, to actually, this is an incredible opportunity and what this can provide in terms of information about what's going on in our bodies. And that's the conversation we hope to change for the future generations to come.
That reaction, sort of the disgust or shame around menstrual blood, did you encounter that in the scientific community when you were developing this?
You know, early on, absolutely. I even recall one of my colleagues who was about to do a PhD in sort of doing feces analysis, sort of looking at, like, you're traveling to the US to do menstrual blood studies. That's really kind of gross, right? And I thought, hey, you are doing feces analyses every day. What do you mean it's gross? But I think absolutely we did get a lot of that, and I do contribute that to some of the reasons, not all, of why this hasn't been done before. It has been looked at as sort of a stigma, a waste product, and gross. I will say, Nyla, which I am sensing this, and I'm excited about this. I do think that the conversation is changing. It's no longer about opinion. It's about the data.
In a moment, more with Dr. Sarah Nasseri. This is One Big Thing from Axios.
Hey Congress, remember the 2017 tax scam that was signed into law? It slashed the corporate tax rate. It served the ultra-wealthy. It ignored the needs of working-class families. It deprived our government of revenue needed for public investments, and it didn't sit well with the public. So lawmakers, this is a reminder. When you give tax cuts to the rich, your approval rating could plummet. Paid for by 1630 Fund.
Welcome back to One Big Thing from Axios. I'm Nyla Budin. Dr. Sarah Nasseri is the doctor and researcher behind Quinn, a women's health company whose diagnostic menstrual pad just got FDA clearance earlier this year. While she tells me other tests will be available soon, so far the pad is only publicly available for testing hemoglobin A1C, useful for tracking diabetes and prediabetes. You grew up in Denmark. You're doing this research here in the US. As we talk about the stigma of menstruation against sort of the backdrop of women's health and a lack of data for a lot of things, how do you think the US compares to other countries?
That is a good question. I think as a whole, women's health unfortunately has been overlooked. I think, even when I think back on my experience in medical school and some of the pretty basic things like heart attacks and what we were taught to look for, we know today that, the symptoms for heart attacks are different in females and males, but that was not made part of my clinical training. I think that's coming. It's the fact that you and I are having this conversation today and more conversation about that there is a gender data gap. That's a real issue that we need to close that. And I think the Nordics, Scandinavian countries in general, I think my experience is that, talking about periods perhaps is a little bit more accepted in some ways, but I think women's health as a whole is as far behind as it is in America.
You mentioned the gender data gap. Can you explain a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, it's the fact that women haven't been included in clinical trials sort of historically. And even, up until recently when Big Pharma do drug development and they are testing phase 1 and they're testing many different kinds of drugs to see what should we take to a phase 2 process. A lot of those studies were done on male rodents. And because women's bodies and female biology, is different, that is potentially excluding opportunities that women could have had that would have worked better for female biology, or putting, solutions out there that frankly doesn't fit perfectly or even remotely to a female biology. And I'll give you an example of chronic pain majority of chronic pain patients are female. But when you look at the clinical trials and the inclusion of women in those clinical trials, they are predominantly studied on male biology. I believe it's 20% only that are actually women that are being included. Now that's a problem, right? And so that's the gender data gap that I'm referring to here, is that the studies we've done and the conclusions we've drawn and the diagnostics that we've have out there and the drugs that we've developed, there is a lack of female representation in those studies. And I think it is very important, and one of the things that I'm very passionate about, we hope women will use the QPAD, not just for their own health, but because we can sort of collectively start to actually close the gender data gap and understand women's health better. And so that's one of the big things that we hope to do in Queen. And I think we've been doing trials for 10 years, frankly, and I think we are not going to stop that. We are going to continue doing that, even as we sort of offer this commercially, which we're of course really excited about with the recent FDA announcement. We are still going to continue to run trials because there is so much that we don't know about female biology and women's health, and that's not going to stop anytime soon.
Sarah, there's data suggesting that women feel like they aren't always heard in medical contexts, or even that their test results are interpreted differently. What are you hearing from women about their experiences, and how are you trying to adapt for those?
I think one of the things that I was surprised by as we've been having conversations with women about their health journeys, about their health experience, and asking them what a product like the QPAD, why that would be exciting for them, what they would want to monitor even, right? What about their health would they want to have more information about? And one of the words that came up, which for me was surprising, because in my mind, of course, the QPAD solves barriers such as, I don't have to drive anywhere to get my information. It's at the comfort of my own home. I can pick up my kids while I'm doing it. People wear the QPAD while they're sleeping, and no needles. That was the things that I thought women would be talking about. But actually, one of the most oftentimes things that we heard women would say was around the notion of control. I want to take control of my own health. I want to be empowered that when I want to know what my iron level is and I want to monitor that, or my cholesterol level, I don't want to have to go and act.
You never quite recovered. It is a lifelong addiction on this beat. I think that Alice has got it right. These are steps that are going to take some months and years to play out. The Biden administration has started negotiating with a handful of drug companies over expensive drugs, but even though they are trying to build up anticipation and attention every time there is an offer made, that we don't know the actual offer amounts. The Biden administration has been sending out alerts and trying to hold announcements and put energy on this. You might remember, as a recovering health journalist, this seems a little bit what happened to Democrats after they passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010. They had all of these things coming, but they couldn't campaign on it right away. It took some years to take effect. And I've seen this with my own eyes. I was in Ohio last month with Health Secretary Javier Becerra, the nation's top health official, and I watched as he tried to make the case that we in the Biden administration are doing all of these things on drug pricing. There are some people acutely aware of those efforts. We haven't really talked about it, but the Biden administration has worked to cap the cost of insulin, for instance. If you're diabetic and need insulin, that is something that is already taking effect. But beyond that, the drug price negotiation is still pretty theoretical, and the impact won't be felt for some time. The Biden administration does want to keep extending these policies, so there's a good chance that if we came back into this roundtable in 5 years, we would have a lot to talk about. But right now, it's very much still in the planning and beginning of the execution phase, not in the results phase.
All right, 5 years to date. Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Obamacare comparison is really apt because the implementation takes many years, but the attacks can come immediately. So you have the pharmaceutical pharmaceutical industry already out there warning that these price negotiations will lead to decreased innovation and new drugs for new cures won't be invented to help your disease. And so people will hear that, but they won't feel the impact of the lower prices yet. And I think you saw that same tension with Obamacare. You had a lot of, claims and attacks on it at first, and the benefits didn't kick in till later.
And now, all these many years later, more than, 13 years later, ACA, Obamacare is
very popular, more popular than ever.
Whoever would have guessed?
Right.
I mean, Obama guessed. That's what he said, that it would become entrenched and popular.
But Democrats paid a huge political price in the short term.
In the short term, right away, they sure did. They lost the House, they lost the Senate. It was a political disaster in the short term. That's so interesting. All right, let's put drug prices to the side just for the moment. Anna, you have an important medical and vaccine story that you've been working on. Your recent investigation for ProPublica is on the rise in syphilis cases among infants and the shortage of the drug that treats the disease during pregnancy. Tell us more about that.
Right, so there's been an increase in syphilis over the last decade or so, but it's really reached crisis levels. The big concern is that when a person who's pregnant doesn't get treated, they can pass it on to their baby, and that can be life-threatening and also cause serious disability. So there's only one drug that can be used to treat people who are pregnant, and that drug is in shortage right now. It's in an official shortage, and I talked to clinics and doctors and health departments all over the country, and they say the shortage is just really more severe than it's been expressed by the federal government. They are having, seeing delays in treating people who are pregnant. They're concerned about not being able to use this drug, which is sort of the preferred drug for other people as well. And it's expected that there will be more of the drug on the third quarter of this year, but right now they're still, managing the shortage and really doling out the drug very carefully, meaning that lots of people aren't getting it. This is happening in the backdrop of a bigger problem with drug shortages. There's a growing number of drugs that are in shortage in the United States, and there's a couple of dynamics there. One is that while we pay a whole lot of money for drugs that are under patent, new drugs, more than any other country, in some ways we pay very little for generics. There's concerns about the muscle of the hospitals being able to drive prices down so much that companies can't afford to stay open with the small prices they're being paid for generics.
Well, we got this text from one of you, right to Anna's point. I'm interested in the continued shortages of common treatments for ADHD, for asthma, for other conditions. It's hard not to think that the manufacturers or intermediaries don't see the demand and send prices further up. Supply chains should be fixed by now. That's a comment from one listener, Anna.
Yeah, there's been some efforts to try and fix the supply chains, but nothing that's worked so far. I mean, there have been hearings in the Senate and other things. This is an ongoing problem, and there's some very particular kinds of drugs that are impacted and by the shortage, that are more likely to have shortages. But so far, there's calls for the federal government maybe to manufacture drugs or to do other things like that. But it has been, it's a tricky issue that has certainly not been solved.
All right. Well, Jessica emails on the issue of drug prices, which is always on people's minds. I so appreciate Biden working to make vials of insulin $35 per bottle. He saved hundreds of thousands of type 1 diabetics like me so much per month. But I'm not sure insulin was the real issue. It's the insulin pump supplies and the durable medical equipment costs that are forcing diabetics like me into poverty. And Dan, we talk every year, perennially in this country, about the price of drugs in America and why they're so much higher in the rest of the world. Rand Corporation found U.S. drug prices over 2 times higher than prices in 33 other countries. Why are we such an outlier on this?
I think the short answer, Todd, is that we're an outlier on all healthcare prices. You can look at hospital prices, doctor bills, and so on, and everything is inflated here. But the long answer, some of it depends on who you ask. The obvious choice is that drug makers, they set their prices very high in the United States. They say that that's necessary to pay for the cost of R&D, but there are clear arguments for why those prices are inflated, especially when you look overseas. And then you talk to the drug makers, and they point their finger at pharmaceutical benefit managers, these middlemen that they say are inflating the system. The listener that you just mentioned, talking about the cost of insulin and the devices, I have talked with Senator Bernie Sanders, the liberal Vermont senator, about this issue a number of times, and he blames the drug industry for tactics like trying to protect patents around drugs and devices in ways that push the price up artificially, and lobbying extensively to try and protect their influence. So insulin as one example of a drug-device combination that has been costly and expensive. Another one that is now on lawmakers' radar, inhalers. If you have asthma, for instance, they have started trying to put similar pressure on inhaler manufacturers the same way that there's been pressure around the cost of insulin.
Talking healthcare with Dan Diamond, health policy reporter at the Washington Post. Alice Holstein from Politico is here, and Anna Berry-Jester from ProPublica. I'm Todd Zwillick. This is 1A. Susan, well, let me read this email from Diane, who says, I have Medicare and also a prescription drug plan. Drug prices are awful. One of my necessary meds costs around $1,000 for a 3-month supply, even with a prescription plan. I now get it from Canada for $300. Similar story to what we just heard about other drugs for rheumatoid condition. My husband also uses Canada for his costly inhalers. The 10 meds the Biden administration approved for drops in prices are a drop in the bucket. None of our meds apply. Dan, a policy meant to lower the cost of drugs hasn't even taken effect yet. And here's one patient paying thousands of dollars on Medicare, still not getting any benefit.
Well, I will say that the Biden administration wants to go beyond the 10 drugs that they're starting, and even this week has said that they are going to try and expand. But yes, it's all a drop in the bucket, Todd. I mean, again, the inhaler issue, I had not realized how expensive and problematic this was for many patients until lawmakers started putting attention on it a few weeks ago. And that, to me, just raised the question, are there 30 issues out there, like insulin, like inhalers, like the drugs that some of the listeners have put the spotlight on today, that are just not getting the attention because the health system is vast and people's conditions are vast with it?
All right, well, there probably isn't a bigger healthcare story in America than reproductive rights and abortion and women's autonomy over those things. So we've talked about drug prices. Let's talk about drug prices. Let's talk about the biggest story in America. Alice, the first over-the-counter birth control pill is set to be available in stores in just a couple of days or weeks. It's called O-Pill. It's been available for decades, and in July of last year, the FDA finally approved it to be sold in stores directly. How significant is this policy?
I'm very curious to see how widely this is used. This is one form of oral contraceptives. There are efforts to get more kinds over the counter because different kinds work differently for different people. There is concern about the price that has been set for this first kind. It's going to be about $20 for a month's supply and about $50 for a 3-month supply. Groups say that that is not affordable for some of the people who most need this. You know, the uninsured, for instance, are going to heavily depend on an over-the-counter option, maybe teenagers, etc. So there's concern about their struggle to afford it. And for people with insurance, it's still not clear if this will be covered by insurance. Some over-the-counter things are, some aren't. And so that remains to be seen as well.
40% of respondents in a Kaiser Family Foundation poll said they'd be willing to pay $10 a month for O-Pill. They could afford that. As you said, this is priced double that.
Right, exactly. And so, but again, it's very significant coming at a time where people in many states have lost access to abortion. Anything that can help people avoid an unwanted pregnancy, you know, could potentially make a difference.
Now, at the same time, I mean, there's so much going on around reproductive rights. We could talk the rest of the hour about abortion itself, about abortifacient drugs like mifepristone, about IVF. We've covered the story in Alabama, but there are also legal battles, Alice, over access to abortion pills in the states. Give us an update, quite apart from these over-the-counter contraceptives. Give us an update on what's happening in states when it comes to abortion medication and legal challenges there.
Yes, so this is going to the Supreme Court later this month, and the Supreme Court is going to hear a challenge to policies making abortion pills more widely available. There are groups that want to turn back the clock so that you can only get the abortion pills directly from a doctor, and undoing more recent policies saying you can get them by mail, you can get them from a local pharmacy, and you can have an online doctor appointment and get them that way. And so this could make a huge difference in terms of availability. Obviously, many states have also passed their own bans, but this is going after the federal regulation, and so this would impact everyone in the country. Even if you live in a state where abortion is legal and protected, this could limit the availability of the pill there.
Anna, what are you hearing from doctors, from patients about the suit to try to take away basically the FDA's authority to regulate and distribute drugs like mifepristone?
Yeah, so this is obviously a big deal in terms of access to abortion and the abortion pill, which is, used by many people. But it also has much bigger implications, and that what's the argument in the case is that the drug is not safe, and the FDA, says it is, and they went through their process for approving this drug. And so if they were to, if the Supreme Court was to find against the Biden administration, essentially saying that the drug was not safe, that could have really big implications for all sorts of drugs and also for future drug approvals within the FDA.
We got this message from Marcus, who says, the healthcare topic I'm worried about is how we stopped fighting the COVID pandemic and instead chose to erase it. We have new scientific studies every day telling us in detail how even mild COVID infections usually cause long-term neurological and cardiovascular damage, and we do nothing about it. We could do easy things like improving ventilation, adding air purifiers, making tests accessible to everyone, and wearing masks in public, but saying so is now taboo, even for public health officials in this country. That message from Marcus, and we're going to talk more about COVID policy, one of the healthcare topics on Your Mind. We're talking all about the latest news from the healthcare world with Dan Diamond from the Washington Post, Alice Olstein, healthcare reporter from Politico, and Anna Barry Jester from ProPublica. Still to come, the measles outbreak in some parts of the country is exposing the polarization of vaccines and divided public trust in healthcare officials, in addition to the problem of disinformation around healthcare. Plus, the latest from a billion-dollar case of Medicare fraud. I'm Todd Zwillick. You're listening to 1A. American Jews have reported more anti-Semitic attacks, hate speech, even bomb threats at synagogues. They say they've been questioned about their identity and allegiance, no matter their politics. The Atlantic's Franklin Foer says those attacks from the right and the left signal an end of a golden age for American Jews. He explains why, next hour on 1N.
Today on Cincinnati Edition, how will recreational marijuana impact medical dispensaries in Ohio? That's today at noon on 91.7.
Support comes from Joseph Clark Gallery, located in Northside, where African culture celebrates African art. You can immerse yourself in the energy of tribal masks, traditional wooden and bronze figures, tribal currencies, textiles, and jewelry, along with original paintings and artwork from local artists. Learn more at josephclarkgallery.com.
President Biden soon speaks to his largest national audience of the year.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
In an address to Congress, he will lay out his agenda against a backdrop of foreign conflicts and domestic uncertainty and the election season. I'm Steve Inskeep. Join me for live special coverage of the State of the Union address from NPR News.
Starting at 9 on 91.7 WVXU and 88.5 WMUB.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from TimberTech, transforming landfill-bound waste into sustainable PVC and composite outdoor decking products designed to look like real wood. More at timbertech.com. Everything wood should be. From Fidelity Investments, a dedicated advisor can help create a wealth plan for a full financial picture. More at fidelity.com/wealth. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
Welcome back. It's 1A. I'm Todd Zwillick. Back to our conversation in just a moment. But first, a quick word about an upcoming show. On Sunday, the red carpet unravels for Hollywood's biggest night. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's the 96th Academy Awards, celebrating this past year's cinematic feats. from Christopher Nolan's imagining of the creation of an atomic bomb in Oppenheimer, love that movie, to the directorial debut of Celine Song's Past Lives, to the pink-drenched Barbie. Love that movie. We're going to go through the big winners who didn't make the cut and what it all means for where Hollywood goes next. So we'd love to hear from you. What movie would win your Best Picture of 2023 and why? You can send in your votes, 855-236-1212. What cinematic achievement over the past year do you think was overlooked? A lot of you are going to be mad after Oscar night, I'm sure of it. 855-236-1A1A. You can leave a message with our app 1A Vox Pop as well, and we'll get to that conversation here on the show on Monday. But for now, let's get back to our conversation about healthcare and the Health News Roundup with Dan Diamond from the Washington Post, Alice Holstein from Politico, and Anna Berry-Jester from ProPublica. And we want to hear from you as well. What healthcare stories are top of mind for you going into this election year, going into tonight's State of the Union speech? What do you want to see the president talk about in front of Congress? One of you sent this text: I'm paying attention to measles in Florida due to the anti-vaccine crowd. Now, Alice, this is a critical story. According to the CDC, there have been 35 measles cases in 15 states in the United States, at least 8 cases in Florida. Florida's outbreak is the largest in the U.S., where the state's Surgeon General is actually under fire for his decision to let parents decide whether or not to quarantine their child in the face of measles. Meanwhile, in Ohio, they mandated a 21-day quarantine period for children infected with measles. Measles was a thing of the past, or so we thought. What's going on here?
So yes, I mean, anti-vax sentiment was definitely brewing before the pandemic. It was, it was on the right and the left. There was skepticism of vaccines, and I'm from California. I remember there being pockets of measles outbreaks there, in sort of kind of hippie areas where people didn't want to vaccinate their kids. But COVID really supercharged that movement. It exposed it to a lot more people who were, scared and looking for someone to blame and looking for answers, and so it just put this misinformation and ideology to a much, much bigger audience. And in some places like Florida, you have these top health officials, sanctioning it and echoing it and doubling down on it. And so that is really fueling the fire right now.
Dan, we are in a position where top officials who should be trusted by the public are doubling down on disinformation when it comes to vaccine. Florida Surgeon General, Alice just mentioned, Joseph Ladapo, he rejected federal guidelines for COVID-19 vaccinations, which in my view sort of set the stage for this sordid return of measles in children now.
Todd, I profiled Florida Surgeon General Ladapo as he emerged as this major COVID skeptic and was struck by how his professional path seemed to be going in one direction before sharply diverging. Just some background on him. He was a college athlete. His friends and colleagues described him as charming and charismatic, maybe a little contrarian, but obviously smart, a Harvard MD, PhD. He supported progressive causes like the Affordable Care Act. If you had said 5 years ago that he would become a health official in the Biden administration, I don't think anyone would have been surprised. And then the pandemic hit, and his contrarianism started inching toward anti-vaccine skepticism. He wrote op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, raising questions about the pandemic response. That got the attention of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who liked what he had to say, brought him to Florida, made him the state's top health official. And I think, having spoken with Dr. Ladapo, every effort he made to question COVID response and settled science pushed him further and further away from the consensus. And I want to be clear right now, to underline the point, he stands alone on these issues. You mentioned the comparison with Ohio on measles. There's no other state surgeon general warning against taking COVID vaccines, for instance. So he has very much fallen out of favor with the public health establishment, even as he has won this devoted fandom in the anti-vaccine community.
And I reiterate, as we're talking about anti-vax sentiments, we're talking about children here who don't get a say in whether they want to protect themselves or not. We got this text: I'm worried about the anti-vaxxer movement. I work in international development and can say without a doubt that childhood vaccine protocols have made our children and our general population safer, and they are the envy of other countries. That's a text from one listener. Anna, what's your take on the return of measles in America?
Yeah, I think to understand what's happening in Florida and why it's so concerning to other health officials is it's helpful to understand sort of what typically happens when there's a measles outbreak. Officials interview the person who's infected, they find out where they've been, and then they take the very rare step of telling the public when and where that person was so that they know if they might have been exposed. And they do that for a few reasons. It's so that you might know if you've been exposed and you can isolate, but also to encourage people to get vaccinated. And in this case, not only is the Florida providing very scant information, so not encouraging people to get vaccinated, but they're saying that kids who are unvaccinated at this one elementary school where the outbreak, most of the cases have occurred, that they're not even suggesting that they have to stay home from school, which typically they would. So it's both the individual people who might have been exposed that are kind of at risk, but also there's a broader public health messaging that typically happens, and in this case, that's not.
And at the center of our politics, we have characters like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for whatever his other attributes, has built a career on instilling doubt, fear, and disinformation about childhood vaccines across the population. And those things, I think it has to be said, are directly related given his prominent role in American politics right now. Well, we got that comment just a couple of moments ago, Anna, from one listener who said, the federal government is forgetting about COVID and long COVID and not doing some of the simple things, not returning to lockdowns by any means, but doing some of the simple things like ventilation and new policies that can help control the spread of COVID now that it's endemic in American society. Meanwhile, federal free home COVID-19 testing, where we could all get free tests by sending a message on a website, which I did, it's coming to an end. Rates of hospitalizations related to COVID are decreasing, but at least 17,000 people were hospitalized during the week of February 24. That's according to the CDC. That's still an extraordinary number for any measure of public health.
Yeah, there's still tons of cases of COVID out there. So not only did we stop handing out free tests this week, but the CDC also changed its guidelines on isolation for when you have COVID. You know, now they're saying basically when you don't feel sick and you haven't had a fever for 24 hours, you can go back to work and school, which is different from previous where they said to isolate for 5 days. Many people already felt the 5-day isolation was too short, and others feel like this is just responding to where we are, and that a lot of people aren't testing anyways, and also there's a lot of immunity. So this has been a really contentious issue, I think, among all kinds of health experts about how to handle this, but the CDC is saying, no, this is the right thing to do where we're at. And it is akin to sort of what's asked of people when they have flu or RSV or other respiratory infections.
There is no doubt the American public largely has moved on from COVID. It was a terrible time, but people who are in the hospital with the disease have not moved on, and it is still out there, without question. Dan, we started the hour by talking about crime in the business of healthcare, and unfortunately we have to circle back to crime in the business of healthcare because there is a developing story of massive Medicare fraud. House Republicans yesterday addressing an alleged Medicare fraud ring estimated at more than $2 billion, which has affected hundreds of thousands of patients. What happened here? What is this?
This is an issue that is familiar, I think, to some 1A listeners, because I came on a few weeks ago and talked about it, and the listeners were so helpful. They wrote into me at dan.diamond@washpost.com with their own stories, so I would encourage them to do that again. There was a spike beginning about a year and a half ago, Todd, in bills for urinary catheters. These are low-cost devices. They help people who have urinary incontinence. And overnight, Medicare started seeing a major surge in bills for these products, which historically had been used by maybe 40,000, 50,000 Medicare patients per year. But in 2023, they got bills for 400,000 patients. And the bills also soared from about $150 million that Medicare was billed every year to more than $2 billion last year. There is no medical reason, there is no change in these devices, there is nothing that would explain why this market would grow so quickly overnight, why so many patients would be ordering these devices, with the exception of that these are fraudulent orders. And the National Association of ACOs, a healthcare group, helped put a spotlight on this. They traced back the orders to a handful of companies that appear to be connected. They have some things in common in terms of staff and location that began billing Medicare overnight
for these products. We at the Washington Post a few weeks ago confirmed that the FBI and other agencies are investigating. The FBI hasn't commented on that, but we have gotten some other federal officials to talk about the existence of that probe. And there are many seniors out there who are getting bills in the mail from Medicare for these products that they say they never ordered, they never wanted, never received. So it is a problem, and it is a massive amount of fraud. For context, the FBI has talked about $1 billion fraud bust as among its biggest fraud schemes that they've seen. $2 billion plus at this point. Estimates said it might be close to $3 trillion. That's a lot of money. Medicare may not have paid it all out, but it has caught the attention of lawmakers.
You remember the good old days where a $400 million Medicare fraud was a showstopper? Boy, that was fun. $2 billion. You can see why the Justice Department is involved. That's Dan Diamond, health policy reporter at the Washington Post, also speaking with Alice Olstein of Politico and Anna Barry Jester of ProPublica. I'm Todd Zwillich. You're listening to 1A. I don't think that there's a bigger healthcare story in America right now than reproductive rights and abortion. The State of the Union address is tonight. Joe Biden will be on the dais. I'm pretty confident he will mention it. Alice, ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned with the Dobbs decision, abortion is basically undefeated in elections. We're talking Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, special elections in New York. Go down the list. Give me your sense, reporting on this story in swing states as you have been, how the abortion and the reproductive rights debate is starting to play in America's choice here.
Absolutely. So, you know, you mentioned some of those state referendums over the past few years. We don't yet know how many will qualify for the ballot this year, but an unprecedented number of states are trying at once to put abortion directly on the ballot and have voters add protections to their state constitutions. This includes some states where it's currently banned, where they're trying to get it unbanned, and this includes some states where abortion is currently legal, but they're worried it could, you know, come under threat in the future, and they want to shore up protections now. And so I just got back from Arizona, which is one of the states, you know, a major presidential swing state, major Senate swing state, and they also are trying to put an abortion referendum on the ballot. And so that is just galvanizing a lot of attention. And yes, like you said, these measures are undefeated so far, but we haven't seen it in a presidential year. We don't know if, you know, Trump and Biden being on the ballot as they're expected to be will make a difference in how people vote on these and these. And we've also seen over the last few years that sometimes voters turn out, they vote for these abortion rights initiatives, but then they also vote for Republican candidates. And so you're hearing a lot of Democrats saying that these abortion rights referendums are going to juice their turnout, are going to help their candidates. We don't know if that's the case.
And it seems like the idea, pure politics now for a moment, the idea of getting an abortion question on the ballot, say, in Arizona, swing state, is that when a voter who's moderate goes in the voting booth and they're gonna vote, they feel very strongly about the abortion issue, and that nudges their vote in a particular direction. We've seen this political tactic before in the past, but the idea is that it's so salient with voters that it's going to drive a lot of support. What's your read on what's going on out there?
Yeah, certainly it seems like having a measure on the ballot does turn out voters, and there has been resounding support for, you know, abortion protections in various states. But I think also you're seeing that some candidates are enjoying support from coming out and being outspoken. You know, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, when she was up for re-election as governor in Michigan, she spoke very openly about abortion rights, and people credit that with really helping her campaign. So I think it does seem like there's two questions here, right? There's the question of turnout based on having an abortion issue on the ballot, but there's also is being a pro-abortion candidate also, you know, is that also going to drive voters to different people? So yeah, there's lots going on here in this election season.
Dan, take this where you want to. What's the big healthcare story that you're looking forward to tonight or as the election goes forward?
I think one story that is very much on my mind is daylight saving this weekend. I know that might sound silly, but it affects all of us, and it is a health story. It's something I've covered in the past. Does daylight saving time help us or hurt us? There's a lot of evidence that it has some health drawbacks, spring forward especially. So I don't think that's going to come up with the State of the Union. I think that the abortion politics and drug pricing is far more central, but I'm asking White House officials about daylight saving as it comes yet again this year.
Talk to me Monday morning here on 1A how I feel about losing an hour of sleep on Sunday, and you'll get your answer. It won't be good. Alice, go ahead. Your view on the details with which you've been covering abortion in the election.
Yeah, so quickly going back to the state referendums, one of the major things that I'm tracking is efforts by anti-abortion groups and Republican officials to make sure these votes don't happen in the first place, that they never make it to the ballot. And so that's happening through lawsuits, that's happening through, bureaucratic challenges, and it's also
challenging signatures, stuff like that.
Exactly. And there's this big new decline to sign movement that I just reported on, where anti-abortion activists are going out to where people are collecting signatures and trying to dissuade people from signing. It doesn't look like that's working so far, but it's interesting that they're trying that.
There was a statewide judge election in Wisconsin last year in an evenly divided state. The race was
Finally going home. It's 7:35, 52 degrees. Probably gonna rain tomorrow.
Nearly 19 years of existence, the company lost more than $90 million last year. And it did point to this in the prospectus as a risk factor. It said that it has a history of losses and we may not be able to achieve or maintain profitability in the future.
If there is the risk factor, that seems like probably something to start.
And you know, it's interesting timing too, because we're in this moment where I think investors have become sort of less interested in buying companies that are these flashy big names with high profiles but aren't actually making any money. I mean, I think WeWork really sort of changed the interest in those high-flying companies with its failed IPO in 2019.
WeWork was one of the world's most highly valued private companies, but after its failed IPO, it's running low on cash, and it may not have enough money to last the year.
It will be interesting to see what the response to this looks like. I have talked to analysts who said that it's not a deal breaker that Reddit's not making money. They just have to convince investors that they have a way of monetizing all of these users.
Okay, so let me just make sure I have all this straight. Reddit doesn't make any money, is much smaller than most of its competitors, has been around a long time, and doesn't necessarily seem to be trending towards changing any of those things, and is now going public. Do I have that basically right?
That's about right. Yeah, I mean, I think Reddit might say that it is trending towards making money. It's lost less money last year than it did in the year prior, but it's still not making any money.
Okay, so what is Reddit doing here to make up for that? Well, how Reddit-y can a Reddit IPO get, do you think?
So the company has a few other revenue streams that it's trying to grow. It talked about in the prospectus, trying to make it easier for users to make money on the platform from other users through things like tips, which the company could take a portion of. It's also indicated that it plans to grow its revenue by selling data to AI firms to train their large language models. Reddit announced a deal with Google to train AI models using its data. It's reportedly a deal worth $60 million. And one of the other interesting things we learned from this prospectus is that OpenAI CEO Sam Altman is a major investor in Reddit. And so I think that might point to the fact that there may be potential for this company here to do more of this AI data licensing. I don't know how popular that's going to be with users to have their data used to train AI models, but I mean, you certainly can see why the front page of the internet would be a useful thing to use to train AI models.
Totally, yeah. Talk to me about the user base here, because in all of these communities, I suspect that there are a lot of people who are going to feel a lot of feelings about Reddit going public and trying to make a lot of money on the back of essentially them having fun with their friends online. What do Reddit users think of the IPO?
Reddit users certainly are not afraid of letting the company know how they're feeling.
It's an understatement sometimes, I think.
Based on what I've seen, I mean, some people seem to be excited about the possibility. Some people seem to be nervous about some of these potential lines of business that the company is talking about. But one of the unique things that Reddit is doing here is making it possible for a selection of its users, most loyal users, to buy shares in this IPO.
Reddit, which was valued at $10 billion in a fundraising round in 2021, despite being unprofitable, says it will reserve an undetermined number of shares for 75,000 users who will get the opportunity to buy them before the stock starts trading, an advantage usually reserved for high net worth investors and clients of the underwriting banks.
Reddit has sort of said here, we have these really loyal users. We've built this business on the backs of their engagement, and we want to give them an opportunity to participate and to make money here.
Does that feel like the right move from Reddit? Reddit obviously has this incredibly unusual experience of dealing with its community, and its community, like you said, has been very mad at Reddit many times over. Do you have a sense of this, whether it's going to work or not for Reddit as it goes through this?
It's an interesting, sort of risky bet. I think on one hand you have this community that has indicated, I mean, you look at Wall Street Bets, this is clearly a community that's interested in investing, it's interested in participating in these kinds of deals. However, I think you have some users already questioning the business model, in particular this move to license data to AI companies.
Its content? What content did Reddit, the company, create? These are our posts.
Don't get me wrong, I'm happy Reddit is getting paid. But are people actually aware that their content and thoughts are being monetized in this way?
Where can I put a claim in for my share of the payday?
And so you can see how this could be risky. I mean, again, companies usually want to sell their IPO shares to institutional investors. They don't want their stock going up and down dramatically right after the IPO, but retail investors in general are more prone to selling. And then for Reddit users especially, I think there's this question of whether they'll have sort of a conflict of interest if they've also bought shares. Will they push the company to make moves that are in the best interest of users, but not necessarily in the best interest of the business? I think that's the thing that Reddit is going to have to grapple with, but I think they've made it very clear that they're willing to do that, even for users who don't end up buying shares in the IPO. The company has said that now, once it's public, every quarter going forward, it will give users the opportunity to submit questions for consideration to be answered during the quarterly earnings call, which again is usually only open to retail investor analysts. So I think the company seems to be willing to live with its users and die with its users. If this doesn't go well, I think that it's accepting that risk here.
That was Claire Duffy at CNN. Up next, the risk for Reddit.
Today Explained is supported by Progressive Insurance. 4 walls and 4 tires protected. Customers can customize their insurance needs and protect what's important by bundling home and auto today. More at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Today Explained is supported by BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 35,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at BetterHelp.com/public.
Good evening, this is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Mike Edmiston. Stick around for the encore of Cincinnati edition. On the program, Ohio is preparing to open more than 200 recreational marijuana dispensaries by 2026. But how will that impact the existing medical dispensaries? And what else does the state need to do to prepare? That's coming up on Today Explained, beginning at 8 o'clock here on 91.7 WVXU. And 88.5 WFUV.
WVXU strives to bring you the most reliable, local, national, and world news, as well as some of public radio's most popular programs. And no matter how you like to listen, you'll find us on air, streaming at WVXU.org, through our mobile app, or your smart speaker by saying, play WVXU.
This is A. Martinez, host of NPR's Morning Edition. One of the things you can count on from NPR and this station, we got your back when it comes to reporting on the news. And one of the things the station counts on to keep it all going is contributions from listeners. One way you can contribute is to donate a vehicle you no longer need. It's for you, easy to do, and could be worth hundreds of dollars in support. If you don't need it, donate it. Thanks.
To donate your car, go to WVXU.org under Ways to Give.
Coming up this
This week on Cultivating Place, we kick off Women's History Month, visiting with the Queen of Herbs, Jekka McVicker of Jekka's Herb Farm in the United Kingdom. Her long career has brought the gardened world the best the herbs of the world have to offer, to our gardens, our environments, our kitchens, and our souls. Listen in.
Saturday mornings at 7 and Wednesday nights at 10 on 91.7 WBXU.
President Biden soon speaks to his largest national audience of the year.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
In an address to Congress, he will lay out his agenda against a backdrop of foreign conflicts and domestic uncertainty and the election season. I'm Steve Inskeep. Join me for live special coverage of the State of the Union address from NPR News.
Starting at 9 on 91.7 WBXU and 88.5 WMUB.
You know what? There was some weird guy on the forum recently. Forum? Yeah, it's a chat room for people who like to talk about eating human beings, but definitely won't act on it. Wink. Yeah, it's hosted on Reddit, obviously.
Today Explained. I'm David Pierce, filling in as host today. We're back, this time with John Herman, tech columnist at New York Magazine. He recently wrote a piece called Can Reddit Survive Its IPO? I asked him what he meant by that.
Well, I've been following Reddit for a really long time, and I've been using Reddit for longer than I've been reporting on it. And it is an unruly, often disagreeable platform. There is no change there that doesn't get some sort of backlash or some sort of response. And here we have a situation where Reddit is first offering some users a chance to buy into its IPO, and then over the long term as a public company, giving a much broader set of users a chance to buy into the company. And I think what this does is it potentially escalates the kinds of conflicts that they could end up having with their users who, you know, in many cases won't just be users, they'll be part owners. So I don't know, it's never been an easy place to run. It has thwarted numerous leaders over the years. User uprisings have occasionally resulted in executives stepping down. It doesn't seem like this will lower the temperature in the types of conflicts that Reddit inevitably ends up having.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the central tension of all of this, right? That Reddit is this, to some extent, beautiful, unruly place on the internet that has lots of downsides, but also lots of very real upsides. But then on the other side, any attempt to turn that into any kind of stable thing, including stable business, runs the risk of breaking the other side of it. And I think, I'm just thinking about the protests from last summer, which were very much kind of a precursor to what all is happening with the IPO. Can you explain kind of what happened with the protests last year in 2023 and what it might say for what we're about to go through again?
Yeah, what's funny about what happened last year is that it was a really big deal on Reddit. But when you try to describe what happened, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal.
More than 6,000 communities on the popular social networking forum Reddit have gone dark as moderators protest the company's decision to charge some third-party app